Howdy folks, and welcome to the Hillbilly Kitchen. Today we're making southern fried pork chops. Now, what we're doing in this recipe today is we are making basic breaded southern fried pork chops, and we're going to end it off with some gravy made in the pan that the pork chops are made in. There's a whole lot of variations on this recipe, but I want to give you the basic recipe so that you have something to build on and you can change it, adapt it, add different spices to it, whatever you want to do to make it your own. But I know there are a lot of you who are new to the kitchen because of what's going on right now. And I know there are a lot of you who are really having to stretch your food dollar. So this recipe is going to do both those things. And I want to cover, like I said, all the basics, everything you need to know to make this delicious, tasty, tender, and also not make your family sick, because there are a lot of things when you're handling raw meat in the kitchen that you need to know about, and if you're new to the kitchen you might not know those. So basically what you need is you need some pork chops. It can be bone-in or it can be a pork tenderloin, boneless, whatever you want. If you get pork tenderloin, it's very an economical way to prepare or to acquire meat to feed a large family or a large group of people. Pork tenderloin is a boneless cut of meat, and you can usually get it in whole or half tenderloins. It can be up to this long and weigh like 6-7 pounds, but you can get it on sale a lot of times for as little as $1 a pound. And you can always find it on sale for $2 a pound. Even now with the unreal grocery prices, you can still get pork tenderloin on sale. And this is actually was half of a pork tenderloin. I've already cut some of it and got it prepared in different stages for this recipe. But you can have them, like I said, cut it in the grocery store for you, however thick you want it. It's a really good way to buy meat right now, with prices being what they are. For the basic recipe, the only other things you need are a half a cup of milk or half a cup of buttermilk. If you have regular milk, you'll want to add a tablespoon of lemon juice to it or a tablespoon of plain white vinegar to it. And what that's going to do is you're going to marinate your meat in that, and it's going to help tenderize it. And if you don't have buttermilk, if you're using the regular milk and the lemon juice or the vinegar, go ahead when you start the recipe and mix those together in just a small bowl with a lid on it, or a bowl big enough to hold however many pork chops you're going to make. Now this half a cup, it'll do up to about 6 boneless pork chops. If you're going to be making more than that, you'll have to double the recipe. Dump your milk and your lemon juice or your vinegar in the bowl, and that lemon juice or that vinegar is going to kind of curdle the milk. It'll help flavor your meat, but more than that, it will help tenderize it. And the other thing you need is about half a cup of flour for the breading. Now you can use all sorts of things for breading. I have a half a cup of self-rising flour. You can literally use any kind of breadcrumbs. You can use cracker crumbs, any kind of cracker crumbs, buttery crackers, cheese crackers, seasoned crackers. You can crush up croutons. You can buy pre-made breadcrumbs. If you need a gluten-free breading, I highly recommend instant potato flakes or potato flour. It adds a lot of flavor and it works just as well as regular flour. It's a gluten-free thing that you can do to your food that's not going to, you won't feel cheated if you do it. And I actually use potato flakes a lot of times in my breading. I'll cut it half and half with flour just to give it a little extra crispness and a little extra flavor. So for all you gluten-free folks, the potato flakes or potato flour is a great option for this recipe. gosh, I don't know. There's so many things, and you can combine things too. You can do part flour, part crackers, part flour, part breadcrumbs, just whatever you want. But the basic recipe is just half cup of flour. And you need salt and pepper. Now that's the only two things that you really have to have. If you are on a low salt diet, save the salt for the table because you can use less salt and get the same flavor. So you'd want to hold all your salt till the end and you were sitting down to eat and just sprinkle it on it. I put onion powder in. If I'm preparing any kind of meat, I always put onion powder on it because it adds so much flavor. Onion powder is a very inexpensive spice. If you're new to cooking, buy you some salt, pepper, and onion powder, and you'd be amazed at what you can do with that. For the gravy, I'm only going to make a cup of gravy, so I have a cup of milk and about 2 tablespoons of flour, and I'll add salt and pepper and onion powder to that too. But let's talk about our meat. If you are going to store raw meat in your refrigerator, put it in a freezer bag, not in a regular Ziploc bag because regular Ziploc bags tend to leak. Or put it in a bowl with a leak-proof lid on it, something like a Rubbermaid bowl or a Tupperware bowl, something like that, that's not going to leak. The regular Ziploc bags, they tend to be slightly porous sometimes and they will leak. The freezer bags are much less likely to leak, and you don't want to contaminate everything in your refrigerator with raw pork or raw chicken or raw beef. That can really, really make your whole family sick. Now, I don't want to reuse this bag either. If I don't cut all this up and use it all in this recipe, I don't want to put it back in this bag because I have the pork all over the edge of the bag, and that's going to contaminate my refrigerator. So you want to be very careful with that. You really can't clean that off good enough. And anything that the raw meat touches needs to be cleaned. And when I'm done cutting this, I'm going to wash my hands before I touch anything else. I had an ER nurse comment not too long ago, or I'm sorry, not an ER nurse, she was an intensive care nurse. And she said that the majority of their patients that they see in intensive care, it's due to improperly handled food in the kitchen at home, where they've cooked something and cross-contaminated stuff all over their kitchen and they've spread salmonella or E. coli, and you really, really have to be careful with raw meat. But if you're cutting this at home, I mean, if you buy the whole pork loin, you might not know what you want to make with it because it makes great pork roast. You can cook it on the grill. You can make barbecue sandwiches out of it. Or you can do pork chops. You can do thin pork chops and thick pork chops, stuffed pork chops. So you might not want to have them cut it. If you cut it at home, turn it with the fat up. If you turn it with the fat up, when you cut through it, it's easier to get through the fat. If that fat's on the bottom, it's going to tend to string and pull, and it's going to be really hard to cut. You want to make sure you sharpen your knife. And you just cut the pork chops however thick you would like them. You can go anywhere from a 1/2 inch to 1 inch thick. Keep in mind that the thicker the pork chop, the longer it's going to take to cook. And if you're frying them, generally you don't want it super thick because you don't want your breading to burn. Another thing that makes meat tough, if you buy these and you don't know what you're going to cook with them, and then you put them in your freezer, don't cook them frozen. Make sure they are completely thawed out before you cook them. I have a drawer in my refrigerator, that one drawer, it kind of tends to partially freeze stuff, and that's where this was. So it's kind of a little bit frozen, but not really. That actually makes it much easier to slice if it's not super soft. But you wouldn't want to throw it in the frying pan with it still partially frozen. That would tend to make it tough. And this will be completely thawed out by the time it's done marinating, so it will be okay. Again, the knives touch the meat. I want to make sure it goes straight into the sink. I don't want to sit it down and get that on my countertop. A manual meat tenderizer is a great way to make sure that your meat is not tough. I don't really like to use the sprinkle-on tenderizers. I prefer to do this. This also kind of opens it up so that the spices and the seasonings can get into it, the marinade can get into it, and it just takes a second. You just pound each side of the meat. Turn it over. When you're doing this, you do want to kind of watch, and you want to make sure that it doesn't splatter, and anywhere that it splatters, that needs to be wiped and disinfected, because you don't want to come back and sit your finished pork chops down where you splattered your raw pork chops. Or maybe if you're making a salad or something, you certainly don't want to get your salad in where your raw pork chops have been. Okay, you get the idea there. There's no big trick to that. You can get all different kinds of these meat tenderizers. Mine has some pretty good teeth in it, so it really kind of chops into the meat, but it also has an edge with smaller teeth. I like this. This one's very old. I wouldn't have a clue where you get one like this. I always put this in the dishwasher and it's turned it a funny color, but I put it in the dishwasher because the dishwasher sanitizes and sterilizes everything. And again, with stuff that touches meat, you want to make sure it's well cleaned. So what you're going to do once you get them all tenderized is you want to put them in your marinade, put a lid on it so it doesn't spill out in your refrigerator. Put them in the refrigerator and let them sit for about an hour. So I'm going to clean this up, and then we'll be back with our marinated pork chops. Okay, I've got my meat all cleaned up, all the mess from the raw meat, and I've washed my hands, and I have a soapy sponge. Now, I don't like to spray disinfectants in the kitchen, especially when I'm cooking, because I don't want to get that in my food. So I usually just put soap on a sponge. A disinfectant dish soap is fine, and that will clean up the area where I've been working, and I don't have to spray any disinfectant. You can also use wipes. They make all kinds of kitchen wipes that will kill all those germs, and you don't have to spray anything. But you do need to be careful with chemicals around your food, and just a simple dish soap will take care of any germs that are left on the surface. And I had down that mat, so there wasn't much that would have gotten on the countertop. But again, you want to be extra careful. I mean, the cross-contamination is a huge health risk. Just make sure you got it all wiped up good. And here's another little tip. If you use sponges in your kitchen and you have a dishwasher, put your sponges in the silverware container in your dishwasher every time you run it, and it will sanitize them and sterilize them. And then you can just squeeze them out and reuse them. It'll keep them nice and clean, and they'll last for a very long time. You don't have to replace them very often at all if you just stick them in the dishwasher and clean them every time you do the dishes. Okay, and now we've got our pork chops. They've been marinating for about an hour in the lemon juice and milk because I didn't have buttermilk. And now they're ready to bread. You can put stuff in your marinade before you put your pork chops in the refrigerator. You can add all kinds of stuff like hot sauce, hot spices. You can put your salt and your pepper and your onion powder in there and let it sit in those spices while it's marinating. And some of the flavor will get into the meat. It'll help to season it a little bit. I generally, well, sometimes I do it both ways, but I like to season each pork chop as I bread it. So that's what I'm going to do today. I like to make sure I get enough onion powder and enough salt and enough pepper on each pork chop. So dump your flour out on a plate, or you could use one of those cutting boards like we cut the pork on, just something so that the countertop is protected, so that you can clean it up so it doesn't get everywhere. You kind of want to be careful with dripping, because this is all, you know, it all has raw meat in it now. It's not just milk anymore. And you do want to bread them one at a time. And like I said, I want to season mine one at a time. The salt and pepper and onion powder is just a taste. And you can add any spice you want to. You don't necessarily have to add the onion powder. You can add garlic. A really good spice on pork is cinnamon. And that's something that not a lot of people do. And Brett's probably going to say these taste different. Because I'll do the cinnamon a lot of times on them. Not every time, but a lot of times. Now, if you touch this with your hands, you don't want to sprinkle the salt or any other spice on it. Because you don't want to go from this to your spice and then sprinkle salt on at the table. I'm using the fork so my hand has not touched the meat. And you want another plate, which I forgot about. You want to make sure each pork chop gets thoroughly covered with the flour or whatever you're using for breading. Kind of shake off a ton of extra. You don't want to shake it until you shake all the flour off. And put it on a plate, because you're going to put these back in the refrigerator for about 20 minutes. If you're cooking a ton of pork chops for a ton of people, you know, like maybe you got to make 20 pork chops, you can just keep breading them, and by the time you get done breading them, the first ones will have sat for 20 minutes and they'll be ready to go in your pan. But if you're only making them for a couple of people, go ahead and bread them and then stick them back in the fridge. And if you're making dinner, you can peel your potatoes or get your corn ready to go on or whatever while you're doing that. Get your green beans ready. You want to move your flour around each time you dip a new pork chop out on it, and make sure that the flour is covering the plate under the bottom of where your pork chop is going to sit. And, you know, keep in mind the salt. If you are trying to watch it, save the salt for the table, because all your spices lose flavor when you cook them, including salt. And if you only want to consume a small amount of salt, sprinkle it on the table, and a little bit of salt will give you a lot more flavor. It actually doesn't make sense that we don't do that with everything we eat. Again, you get the idea. You just want to sit them out on a plate. And, you know, if you're making a lot, your plate's going to stack up and get deeper and deeper. Put a piece of wax paper in between them. If you got to make if you have to make more than a layer of pork chops, put a piece of wax paper, a piece of saran wrap, a piece of parchment paper, something in between them. Otherwise, they will stick together while they're sitting there, and the breading is kind of sticking to the pork chop. So make sure you put a piece of some kind of paper in between them, or saran wrap, so they don't stick together. But you can just keep breading them and stacking them up. And like I said, you can use any spices you want. You don't have to just use the salt and pepper and onion powder. This is just kind of the basic recipe. Okay, so I'm going to cover these and put them in the refrigerator for 20 minutes. Again, you want to make sure you wash your hands and you clean up your mess. You don't want anything that's splattered off those raw pork chops left on your countertop. Okay, a lot of folks have asked me about using the flour that you use to bread in gravy. And some people have said, no, don't do it. You can use this flour to make your gravy. You don't need the extra flour. If you have flour left over, it's fine to use this. because you're going to cook it. Now, you wouldn't want to dump this back in your flour bag, and you certainly wouldn't want to like put it in a small bag and leave it sitting out and just use it for whatever, because it does have that raw meat in it, and you don't want to leave it sitting out. Now, if you were making pork chops today and you were making chicken tomorrow, you could put this in some kind of an airtight container, a bowl with a lid, a Ziploc bag or something, and you could put it in the refrigerator and you could use it for your recipe tomorrow. But you don't want to use it on anything that's not going to be cooked. You don't want to leave it sitting out of the refrigerator if you're not going to use it immediately, and you wouldn't want to put it back in your bag, because your whole bag of flour would be bad then. But if you want to use this in your gravy instead of getting out more flour, it is fine. It's going to be cooked, and in fact, I'm going to use some of that in the gravy instead of what I've got here. Here are our pork chops that have been in the refrigerator for about 20 minutes. Now, you can see that the flour that's on them is now wet and it's stuck to them. That's why I said if you're making a whole bunch and you're going to stack them, you're going to want to put something in between them, or they'll stick together, and then when you peel them apart to fry them, it's just going to make a big mess and all your breading is going to come off. Okay, now we want to get our stove eye turned on and get our pan hot. What you use to cook these in is entirely up to you. I'm just using oil. You can use your leftover bacon grease. You can use butter. You could use Crisco. You could use lard. You can use pretty much whatever you have. It doesn't have to be any kind of special oil. If you're watching your cholesterol, something like olive oil or grapeseed oil is a great option. If you're looking for the most flavor, I would recommend the bacon grease. If you don't have any health issues and you're eating plenty of cucumbers and tomatoes, go ahead and cook them in that bacon grease. How much oil you need is going to depend on how many pork chops you're cooking, and it's also going to kind of depend on how much fat that was on them. Now, you saw that pork loin that I had. It didn't have much fat on it. It just had a little tiny strip, and it wasn't even covering all of it, a very thin strip. But I'm not making a ton of pork chops, so I'm not going to need a ton of oil. You do want to make sure the bottom of your pan is coated good. If you're going to be cooking a whole big bunch of pork chops, I would not put all of my oil in the pan at one time. I would add a little as I need it. That kind of helps keep the oil from burning, and it'll help keep your pork chops from burning. Now, you don't want to add your pork chops to the pan until your pan is hot, and the grease is really hot. Whatever kind of grease you're using, you want it really, really hot before you put your pork chops in there. If you put your braided pork chops in a cold pan, they're going to stick. I'm going to test my grease with a little bit of this flour. Okay, you can see how the grease or the flour is bubbling there. That means my grease is hot. So my pan is ready to add my pork chops. You want to treat this plate that you had them on in the refrigerator just like everything else that the raw meat's touched. You don't want anything else to get on it, and you don't want to leave it sitting out because you don't want any of that raw meat to get on anything else. Now, every stove is a little bit different. You want to adjust your heat. You're going to cook them over about medium, but you want to adjust your heat. You want to keep a nice sizzle going. You certainly don't want them to stop sizzling, but you don't want your pan too hot either. You don't want to burn them before they get done. There's a old saying in cooking, low and slow is best, and low and slow is just about always best with meat. If you cook it slow on low heat, it's going to be more tender. It's going to be juicier, and it's going to have a lot more flavor. I don't know if you can see this or not, but you probably can. Because of the size of my stove eye and the size of my pan is not centered on my stove eye. The center of my heat is actually right about where I've got the spatula here. So this part of the pan is much hotter than this part of the pan. And you can see probably that I barely have any sizzle going on over here, but I have lots of sizzle going on over here. Now, what that means is that before I even flip my pork chops, I'm going to want to try to rotate them. I'm going to want to try to get this pork chop back here over to the cool side of the pan and get these two over to the hot side of the pan. And, you know, that's just something that happens sometimes when you're cooking. And as you cook more and more, you will learn to compensate for stuff like a cold side of the pan. This cooktop, if you didn't watch the last video, I think, or maybe even the video before that, I talked about this cooktop. I put this in the kitchen just for videos, but also so that I could can, because you can't can on a glass top stove. It's not recommended. Now, what I just did, rearranging the pork chops in the pan, is this side of these two chops, the outside, was closest to the heat source, so I scooted them out toward the edge of the pan, and I put these two sides in toward the middle where the majority of the heat was. And even my pork chop that was up here on the hot side of the pan, I've got the edge that was in toward the middle of the pan now on the outside of the pan, and the edge that was on the outside in toward the middle. And that'll make them brown more even. People watched the video that, I'm not even sure which one it was. It might have been the sausage gravy video where I grabbed the handle of the iron skillet. Well, if you haven't cooked with an iron skillet, the handles get very, very hot, and you need to be careful. Now, I've cooked for almost 50 years, literally, and I've always had iron skillets in the kitchen. So I know what I can get away with and what I can't without getting burned. I would never recommend that anybody touch the handle of an iron skillet. Now, this one is bearable to about right there. Any farther in, and you got a blister. But just for the purpose of stirring gravy or flipping these pork chops, I can hold it out here on the end because I've got it turned away from the heat. Well, I know that, but if you're new in the kitchen, don't touch an iron skillet with your bare hand. That's probably about 5 minutes on that side. These were not super thick, so it's not going to take a long time to cook them. Maybe 10 minutes and they'll be done. And it's generally a smart idea if you have a fork or something else handy when you're flipping them, so that you don't slop the grease out everywhere like I did. If you've got your fork that you use for breading them or another fork, you can kind of control them as they fall down when you flip them, and it doesn't slop grease everywhere. As you're cooking them too, they will release from the pan when they get done. That's as low as that stove eye goes. I was going to try and turn it down a little bit because these are kind of frying a little bit fast. They'll be okay, but a little lower would probably be better, and I will probably turn the heat completely off before they're done and just let the heat in the skillet finish them, because I want them to get done, but I don't want them burned. You can see how evenly brown these are. Now, that's because I rotated them before I turned them, and I got them all moved over to the heat. And that's what caused them to cook even like that. If you have a cold spot in your pan and you don't rotate them, they won't cook evenly. Okay, my pork chops are already brown on the other side. I lifted them up a little bit to check, and I could see that they were definitely brown, but they're not quite done. And I've talked a lot about safe handling of meat, and I know I'm going to have somebody ask about a meat thermometer. If you stick a meat thermometer in this, you're going to have a very hard time getting an accurate reading. It's going to pick up the heat from the skillet, and it's just not going to be accurate. I've never used a meat thermometer when I was frying meat or when I was baking meat. I've always cooked it until it's done. Now, if you're new to cooking, I suggest getting a paring knife or a steak knife or something. Cut whatever you're cooking, cut it right through the center and check it. Because whoever you're feeding would rather have their fried pork chop cut in half than they would get sick from having raw meat. And the best way to tell if that meat's done or not is to cut it in half and look at it. Like I said, if you try to use a meat thermometer, especially if you're not experienced, you're going to get the heat from the pan, not the heat in the center of the pork chop. And those pork chops were less than ½ an inch thick. So how in the world are you going to get it right dead in the center of that pork chop and not pick up the heat from the pan? And if the stove eye is still on, you're certainly going to get the heat from the stove eye. So, you know, the meat thermometer is not the best way to check it. If you're new to cooking or if you've been cooking for forever, cut it in half, look at it, make sure it's done. A pork chop should be it should be white, completely white. You shouldn't see any pink in it. And it should break, actually. You should be able to bend it and break it. And if for some reason you flip it over and it's not completely brown, you can flip them more than once. Cook them until they get as brown as you want them. Now it's really starting to die down. I'm going to turn my stove back on. I don't want my pan to cool down because I'm going to make the gravy in it, but I didn't want my pork chops to burn because they were already brown. And the stove eye was as low as it could go. Now, if you're cooking in an iron skillet too, an iron skillet will hold heat and your food will continue to cook in it after it's turned off. So keep that in mind. You don't want to leave your pork chops or whatever sitting in the skillet on the stove eye and think that it's just going to keep them warm, because it's not. It's going to keep cooking them. And you can see how golden brown these are. Now, if you cook these in a no-stick skillet, a porcelain-coated skillet or something like that, you're going to have a much easier time. They're going to brown really nice. You're not going to have to worry about them sticking. So if you don't have a cast iron pan, you can certainly cook them in a coated skillet. I do recommend the porcelain coated skillets over the Teflon. Teflon has been known to cause quite a few health problems. So if you're shopping for a non-stick skillet, look for some of the porcelain coated ones. As far as a particular brand, you know, shop around. You can get them fairly reasonable. Okay. My pork chops are done now, and they've been cooking, like I said, about 10 minutes aside. And they were only about ½ an inch thick. I like to drain them on a rack. If you have a rack and you can drain them on a rack, it will keep your breading far more crisp than if you put them on paper towels. Also, if you have to make a whole bunch, you can put this rack on a cookie sheet. You can put it in the oven on warm, and it will keep the pork chops nice and crunchy while you finish cooking them, and it will also keep them, you know, they won't go bad while you're cooking the rest of them. Okay, so I'm going to make my gravy. Now, I've done quite a few gravy videos. but folks still seem to have trouble with gravy. There's not a whole lot of grease in here. I don't want a whole lot of grease. Back in the day, every single meal had gravy with it. And that's because that was a way of using every single drop of grease. Grease, fat, has a lot of calories in it. And if you're out in the field planting and plowing and hoeing and chopping down trees and working a farm, you're going to need every calorie you can get just to stay alive. Well, we don't need that many calories these days. So when I make gravy, I don't like it greasy. I remove any excess grease. Now, I happen to not have any excess grease in here this time, but you'll hear people give exact recipes, 2 tablespoons of flour and 2 tablespoons of grease. That's too much grease. I'm just putting a little onion powder in there. I'm going to put a little salt in. See how that onion powder browns up? That's really going to make it taste good. Add a little pepper. Everybody knows gravy needs pepper. You just need enough grease to moisten your flour and you can make gravy. Add your milk all at once and then stir it. And I can see grease floating on top of my gravy. That's actually a little more grease than I like in it. I don't like to see that grease on top of the gravy. Cut the heat off. This stove's going to take a little bit of getting used to. But all you do once you add your milk is you bring it to a boil, and that makes gravy. And that was on low. Normally I'd bring it to a boil a little bit slower than that, but that works too. Now you can see how easy, how fast, how simple that was. I just put the flour in there and browned it. Now you do want to cook the flour. If you put flour in your pan for your gravy and you do not brown it, you don't cook it a little bit, your gravy's going to taste like flour. And I guess I did a video years ago when I didn't say that specifically, and I've had a lot of questions about that. Why does my gravy taste like flour? Well, you gotta cook that flour. That's why I said you can use the flour that you breaded your pork chops in, because you are going to cook it. You could even use that milk or buttermilk that you marinated the pork chops in the gravy, because you're cooking it. I mean, it came to a full boil, but if you do that, you make sure you bring it to a full boil, because you want to kill anything that got in it from the raw meat. Now, this is already pretty thick. You can see it stays off the side of the pan, and it's going to continue, or off the side of the pan. It stays off the bottom of the pan when I stir it, but it's going to continue to get thick as it cools. Now, I only made a cup of gravy because it's just me and Brett, and you can reheat gravy. You usually have to add a little milk to it, but it's not great, and it actually takes less time to make gravy than it does to reheat gravy. So whenever I do gravy, I always do it fresh. I don't generally do enough for leftovers. Now, if you want to make a whole bunch of fried pork chops and you want to have some for later, you can actually freeze these. Again, you would want to separate them with wax paper or something like that and freeze them. And when you heat them up, you can heat them up in the oven. and have a quick dinner. If you've got extra time on the weekend and you want to make a bunch, or you're making them for dinner and you want to make enough for 2 meals so you can have a quick meal later, freeze them, put wax paper between them, thaw them out. You can even use the defrost cycle on the microwave if you're careful with it. You don't want to get them too hot doing that. And then put them in the oven to heat them up. And they'll be just like fresh, nice and crisp, as long as you do them in the oven on a rack. That literally is all there is to making basic old-fashioned southern fried breaded pork chops. And now you can smother them in gravy, because the gravy's super easy. Chefs try to make gravy seem all complicated. It's just grease and flour and a little milk. That's all there is to it. You just want to make sure you get it hot. So give these a try. Spice them up a little bit if you want to. Change the breading and shift them up. But you can see that basic flour does a really nice coating on them, and it comes out nice and crisp. And it's going to have a ton of flavor just with that onion powder and pepper. Kind of let me know what you think in the comments. Maybe what you like to add to them, or what you like to have to eat with them. Thank y'all so much for joining us in the Hillbilly Kitchen. If you haven't already, please don't forget to click like and subscribe for more of these great basic old recipes. And until next time, remember to put God first.